The Story of Oakenhail Pass. The air was chilly, cold even, and you would think most people would be inside, probably playing video games or watching the 12 o'clock news or baking sweets for their family members. Caleb, however, was seated in his closet by the open window in his room, dismissing the cold. The book he was reading was very enticing in his opinion, describing a range of astronomical facts and somewhat complicated theories based off of advanced physics. He was very interested in space and mathematics and English and every other academic topic you could think of. Despite this, he rarely socialized, even to communicate his own theories and ideas to others. He never felt the need to, because he was homeschooled, and even his family rarely cared to speak with him. "Kids, dinner's ready, it's your favorite," a voice shouted from somewhere in between the stairwell and the kitchen. "Okay, Dad," Caleb shouted back, even though he wasn't that hungry, and even if he was too smothered in his book to notice. Otherwise, he liked his parents' cooking, more than his own, which he would have to eat if he didn't go downstairs and get some dinner before his older siblings did. He had a brother and a sister who were identical twins named Shane and Sierra. They were also born only 6 minutes apart, Shane being the firstborn out of the two. They were both tall, dirty-haired, and wide-faced, while Caleb was average height, with black hair and a more narrow face. He was skinny, skipping mealtimes regularly because of his nasty brother. Walking into the dining room, all he smelled was broccoli and casserole and other things he did really like, so he decided that maybe eating when he wasn't that hungry wouldn't hurt. "I win!" His siblings rushed in through the front door, sweating and panting despite the cool weather. The voice was Shane's. He was always slower at running than Sierra, so he took great pride in when he won. "Ha! You know what that means," he then shouted, catching his breath afterwards. "It means I have to give you $5, I know," Sierra defeatedly replied. Caleb knew she didn't have any reason to, though. She had a job, which paid $4 an hour because there were so many employees at the sports shop she worked at. Being a lonely 13-year-old, Caleb saw this as a lot of money. The most he'd ever gotten for any job was about $20. But then he would always get bored and go home to read or practice a mathematical formula, or something along those lines. Caleb was most intelligent of the three, but he couldn't take much pride in it. His siblings, mostly Shane, teased him too much. "Hey, Mr. Know-It-All, what would the fraction of food you would get tonight be if we were hungry?" Shane asked sarcastically. 1/5. That's what I would get. Why? Caleb replied matter-of-factly. His siblings paused. He usually answered something along the lines of none, but tonight you could see the cold anger in his eyes, like he'd gotten sick and tired of all the nights he would go to bed hungry. "Are you kidding?" Shane laughed it off, as if his little brother couldn't stand a chance and would back out like the skinny nerd he was. "You know I never kid. My question is, why don't you just accept that I'm more intelligent than you? Your jealousy is simply immature," Caleb snapped at him. His cold blue eyes caused Shane to freeze. Shane scowled at his brother and stepped forward dominantly. "Yeah!" Caleb fell to the hardwood floor, yelling. Shane had grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and nudged him to assert his dominance, but he'd pushed too hard. "Shane, Sierra, Caleb, stop roughhousing at the table. Go outside if you're going to fight," their father called from the kitchen. He emerged from the doorway seconds later with a bowl of cauliflower. "I'm not hungry anymore. I'm going outside," said Caleb, as he looked away in fear of his father seeing how red his face was, and the tears pooling at his tear ducts and waterline. He stood up, glared at his brother, and walked out the door, not bothering to put on a coat. The icy air gnawed at him, inching up his spine and nearly outdoing the coldness he felt towards his brother. He would have shivered if the air's low temperature was more potent, but the only thing that made his teeth and bones chatter was when a strong breeze flew down the street he was walking down. He looked towards the opposite side of the street absent-mindedly, and thought of the small shrub-submerged path he had always been wary of walking down. He had heard rumors of a cemetery which laid a couple miles in, but had never believed them. His curiosity got the best of him, and he started jogging a bit faster. His intent to find out what the trail held was overwhelming. The cold air scraped at his spine, and his skin turned so pale he could be mistaken for a ghost. He saw the trail up ahead, and the tree branches and dead bushes made it look so dreary. A cold shiver flew across his flesh, but this time it wasn't the temperature. He was already numb from that. It was fear, subtle but present, as a result of the negative vibe he was receiving from the path he had always been anxious to approach. He stepped through the invisible door which led into a vast forest. Even though there were at least 8 or 10 feet in between most of the trees, he still could not see more than 20 feet off in any direction, except behind him and ahead. He did not turn back, because he had no reason to. They say the journey is half the battle, and who stops fighting halfway through a battle if there's no more apparent danger than there was before? The wind howled, and the weak, comatose trees cracked loudly, the sound echoing endlessly across the woods. Soon, the noise ceased. He progressed through the eerie woods and down the path until he caught a glimpse of something through the thick layer of leaves. Through the enveloping darkness which laid ahead, there shone an orange-yellow light, which quivered accordingly to the chilly breeze. Then he heard the melodic snapping of twigs and the crushing of underbrush, accompanied by a low humming. It looked like a fire, a glowing, warm fire with embers floating off into the air and speckling the sky with red stars. The stars slowly flew out of sight behind tall, drooping trees and sparkled until they disappeared. As he approached the now intensifying chanting, he felt his heart beat to the sound. I wonder, he thought, if maybe these are just a bunch of teenagers, listening to that imbecilic music they play so very loudly every weekend. But he knew it wasn't. This music, it wasn't the same. It was much, much different. The beat, the tone of the humming, he didn't know what it was, but it was different. He finally reached the last dense layer of underbrush. By then, the humming had become bellowing chanting, and even through the thick shrubs he could feel the overwhelming heat. He brushed a leaf from the barrier before him and peeked through the slit. Hundreds of thoughts ran through his head. What he saw was incomprehensible, even for him. He saw them march in a circle right alongside the blazing fire, and he heard them shouting what he thought was gibberish. He had never heard a language like it. He leaned into the bush a bit more to see the ritual, that's what it seemed like, but lost his balance. His ankles twisted, and he fell through the remaining mass of bush, revealing himself to the group in black robes. Before he could let go of the breath he was holding, or scream, or struggle, or do anything at all, the silhouettes hoisted him up and shouted something he couldn't understand. They set him down on a makeshift gurney, then did something unspeakable. They threw him in the fire. They had just thrown him, Caleb Andrew Thomas, into a blazing storm of ash and hot red coals. He felt the heat cradle him, and the hot charcoal specks floating all around him. There was no pain, just the sensation of being held. He assumed that this was the feeling of death, and the whisperings he heard were the voice of death himself. Then it all faded to black. He thought maybe he had closed his eyes, because he didn't feel dead yet. Maybe this was the end, though. If I knew this would happen, I would have... I'm not sure, but... His thought was interrupted by a shrill scream somewhere behind him in the blackness, where things were coming more into focus. The darkness was slowly fading, revealing a shadow-covered room. The room became silent, so much so that even his thoughts were hushed. A lump formed in his throat, and he quieted his unsteady breaths. He assumed he was simply feeling paranoid, so he kept walking, only now with more caution. He glanced around the room, focusing on the areas which seemed to be illuminated by strands of moonlight. Fumbling nervously in his pockets, he reached for the flashlight that he always kept on him as a precaution. The area he lived in was notorious for power outages. He raised the small black flashlight in front of him, flipping the switch near its center. Dread gnawed at his abdomen for a moment, until a dim glow finally began to emit from its top. He saw a mere 10 feet in front of him, but it sufficed. He scanned the room. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made of cracked, painted cement, and the window to his left was barred. There was a doorway in front of him, and a bit to the right. The scream he had previously heard was undoubtedly in that direction. Shuffling through the low door frame, he felt the eerie feeling as if someone had been watching him. Despite his urge to think logically and dismiss it, he knew that it wasn't just a feeling. He also knew that whatever screamed needed his help. All he heard now was his own deafening heartbeat pounding in his ears so loudly he could feel it in his toes. Well, that and his footsteps pattering on the damp cement floor. He was wondering many hundreds of things. Who was the girl, he had assumed them to be female, screaming at? Who, or what, were those silhouetted figures in robes? And finally, why hadn't the fire hurt? As he got closer, shadows and figures began dancing in the small area of light ahead of him. He shuffled closer, and closer, and closer. until he reached a corner separating him from the source of the flickering light. He turned the cracked, uneven corner and laid his eyes on a small, bony, and pale little girl, maybe a year or two younger than him. She sobbed quietly, shivering under the scraps of dirty clothing she wore to conceal herself. Caleb was inarguably distraught, but he knew that the girl was so much more so. He let go of the shallow breath he had been holding, which gathered the girl's attention. She turned to him, brows furrowed. Her eyes were bloodshot, and the areas around them rubbed completely raw. Purple and red veins cradled her features, contrasting with her pale blue flesh. He gasped and fell back in fear, disgust crawling across his face. Her lips contorted into an open-mouthed grin, exposing her chipped, rotting fangs. She then spoke.
"Greetings, young one. What may I refer to you by?"
Her distorted voice quivered and shook, causing poor Caleb to do the same. My name is Caleb Thomas," he mumbled.
"All right. I have a bit of advice for you, dear,"
she stated, as if he had no choice. Caleb tilted his head in confusion before she continued.
"Do not struggle. It is for your own good."
He was interrupted by several hands clutching him, holding him in place. He disobeyed the girl and struggled more so than he had every time his brother nailed him to the floor of his home.
"Any last words before it's too late?"
the girl creature inquired, smirking. I have a favor for you."
"What might it be?"
The girl looked confused. "Do whatever you do to me, to Shane Alexander Thomas." The girl hesitated for a moment, then smiled.
"No can do, dear. I'll be far too full once I'm done with you."
She then grasped him by the shoulders, fingernails extending into claws which bled at the base. She slowly dragged her serrated claws down his chest, separating strings of thick flesh. He trembled and screamed as the figures in robes held him tightly, preventing him from avoiding the hungry girl's consumption. She proceeded to feast upon the screeching boy, even as his screams faded away. The reclusive ones always tasted the most peculiar, in her opinion. She was glad that the boy was so young, because who doesn't like a little bit of delicious, innocent fear?